So I just watched Joker this morning, and I have to say the movie is an absolute masterpiece in brilliant social commentary. In this video, I'm going to talk about the politics of Joker, and there's going to be spoilers, so if you haven't watched the movie and you're planning on doing so, I would recommend you watch my video after you've seen it. The first thing I want to talk about is the setting of the movie. This movie is set in the mid-1980s. It's set in the fictional city of Gotham, which obviously draws a lot of inspiration from New York City. I think the decision to set the movie in the 1980s is absolutely brilliant. For those of you unfamiliar with the history of New York City, the 80s were pretty much the darkest time in that city's history. In fact, crime rates in the United States were at their highest in the 1980s. During the 1980s, New York City was an incredibly violent place. Drug addiction to heroin specifically, and also later on crack cocaine, was just rampant throughout the city. New York police rarely enforced the drug laws in the 1980s, and it showed. This movie portrays Gotham City pretty similar to how New York City would have been during that same period of time. A violent, dirty, broken down, disgusting place filled with garbage and rats. But I actually believe the gritty depiction in the movie, if anything, understates the reality of what it was like to live in New York City during that period of time. It wouldn't be unusual, for example, for a New Yorker in the 80s to see transient people strung out on heroin just lying on the sidewalks or stoops of houses. Real estate in a place like New York City today is very valuable and expensive, but back in the 1980s it wasn't. And this, coupled with the fact that New York City's housing stock was so old, led to a lot of slum-like conditions in a lot of New York City neighborhoods. Buildings would be falling apart, there would be rats and cockroach infestations. It was a really dirty and disgusting place to live during this period of time. I think it makes a lot of sense that Todd Phillips chose the 80s as the setting of this movie. And I really appreciate the fact that he does it in such a way that does not glamorize this period of time at all. There's no classic 80s music in this movie. There's nothing to celebrate that period of time. This leads me to the central focal point of this movie, where Joker gets into an altercation with three frat boyish like investment bankers who he ends up murdering on a subway train. Now, this is a direct allusion to an actual historical event that's quite infamous that happened in New York City in the 1980s, and that's the 1984 subway shooting committed by Bernard Goetz. For those of you unfamiliar with who Bernard Goetz is, he was a New Yorker who was tired of constantly being a victim of crime, so he ended up arming himself with a handgun. On December 22nd, 1984, 4 black teenagers robbed him on the subway train. Rather than once again be a victim, Bernard Goetz used his handgun to defend himself, and he ended up shooting the 4 black teenagers. None of them died, but some of them experienced permanent physical disabilities as a result of being shot by Bernard Goetz. New York attempted to prosecute Bernard Goetz for attempted murder for shooting the 4 black teenagers who robbed him. And the media at that time portrayed Bernard Goetz as a racist. However, the jury ended up acquitting Bernard Goetz, and he became a folk hero. In fact, the Bernard Goetz case served as sort of an inspiration for the movie Death Wish 3, a film series starring Charles Bronson, where Charles Bronson plays a vigilante who is fed up with crime, a similar character to Bernard Goetz himself.
New York, a city pushed to the edge. People pushed to the limit, and no one's got the guts to stop them.
It's collection time, Charlie.
3 murders, 4 rapes, 9 acts of random violence. This isn't a neighborhood, it's a war.
But there is one way. One man who won't be pushed. Charles Bronson.
What's the problem? Now you're gonna die.
It'll be just like before, Mr. Vigilante.
Going back to Joker, it takes this historical event, the same sort of situation, and turns it on its head. This time, instead of black teenage thugs being the ones that are killed, it is these rich white men investment banker types. I believe the reason that Todd Phillips put this in the movie, the reason that he made it the focal point, was to be a giant middle finger, a giant fuck you to social justice warriors. And I say that for one because it's a reference to this historical event, one which I'm sure most social justice warriors would say was a great injustice, one that would get them very upset. And he takes it and he turns it around to be like, well, okay, what if it was rich white men who were killed? How do you like this situation now? Now, is this a good thing? Do you enjoy this? And I think a big part of the reason why it appears the social justice warriors just hate this movie, are so put off by it, because this scene is a complete mockery of that social justice lens that so many people use to look at the world. Aside from that, why would the social justice warriors find something like that so off-putting, right? They're always complaining about the rich white men. So why aren't they celebrating this scene in the movie? And this is where Todd Phillips' commentary goes beyond just scoring a hit. He nails a fucking home run here. From my perspective, this is a provocative statement being made about social classes in the United States. The conventional way of thinking about class is that you have the poor at the bottom, you have the middle class, and you have the rich. However, a different way, and in my view, more valuable way of looking at class is to evaluate people into two separate groups: those who work and those who do not work. If you were to do this, you would find that wealth varies in both groups. However, the more extremes, the people more likely to be impoverished and more likely to be extremely rich, fall into the group that does not work. This would include people who live off of welfare benefits and don't work at all or provide any wage labor. It would include criminals whose job is to steal things from other people. And it would include rich people who own assets that provide them with income. So, for example, a rich person might be able to live a life of luxury without working because they own several apartment buildings and they collect rent from those apartment buildings. From the perspective of someone who is a working person, there's a lot of reason to be resentful of the people who don't work on both ends of the spectrum. If they are a criminal, then they're a direct threat to the working person. The working person has to worry about criminals stealing the money and possessions that they obtain through hard work. If they're a person who lives off of the welfare system and contributes nothing, then the working person has a reason to be resentful that this person just mooches off of other people's labor. If they are a wealthy person who does not work and receives all of their income through assets, then they're someone who provides nothing of added value to society. They make money simply by owning things. This sort of rent-seeking behavior that the ultra-rich engages in is just as much of a mooching off of other people's work as that of the criminal or the chronic welfare recipient who does not work. The three investment bankers that Joker ends up killing in the movie are not themselves non-working people. Instead, they work for Thomas Wayne, and it is Thomas Wayne who is the non-working person who lives off of his assets. An investment banker, after all, is an extremely highly paid worker who helps wealthy people become more wealthy by managing their investments and assets. So the scene in which the Joker kills these three white investment bankers is deliberately sort of crafted to be almost like a cynical parody of what a social justice warrior would want, while at the same time it attacks that sort of ideology with a class-based criticism that exposes social justice warriorism for what it is: empty virtue signaling mostly made by wealthy white people. The fact that the scene also mirrors a real-life incident that outrages social justice people, the Bernard Goetz subway shooting, makes it all the more profound. I can't imagine how you could send a bigger middle finger to woke capital than what Joker does in that particular scene. and it's brilliant. Another theme that this movie handles brilliantly is mental illness and how US society completely fails the needs of people who are mentally ill. Joaquin Phoenix's performance as Joker as a mentally ill individual is absolutely phenomenal. If you want to see fantastic acting, then I would recommend you watch this movie. He does a great job of portraying someone who I'm sure most people in the audience, after watching the movie, would come to the conclusion of this is a person who should not be out on the streets. And in fact, Joker himself says as much in the opening scene when he's talking to his social worker. He tells the social worker that he was more comfortable living in the mental hospital where he used to live. During the course of the movie, Joker is someone who's just trying to survive despite his mental illness. He's trying to take care of himself and his mother, and ultimately his goal is just to have positive interactions with other people, to make them laugh. But because other people are cynical and mean and nasty, Joker ends up repeatedly having negative interactions with people, and he can't deal with those reactions. Because of his mental illness, he's just not prepared for or capable of dealing with the sorts of other people that are out there in the modern society. This once again harkens back to the brilliance of setting this movie in the 80s. You see, the late 70s and 80s was a period of time where a lot of people who normally would have been in mental institutions or insane asylums were released out onto the street. This is due to a Supreme Court decision that came out in 1975 called O'Connor v. Donaldson. O'Connor v. Donaldson made it a national precedent that individuals could not be confined at mental health institutions unless it could be demonstrated that that person posed an imminent threat of harm to themselves or other people. In the years following this opinion, which once again was reached in 1975, mental health institutions closed en masse. Huge numbers of people with mental illnesses were released out onto the street. These were people who were not necessarily capable of functioning in society. But remember, according to O'Connor v. Donaldson, that wasn't reason enough for them to be confined in mental institutions. Mental hospitals could only hold those people if they posed an imminent safety risk to themselves or other people. Of course, the O'Connor v. Donaldson Supreme Court opinion was viewed as a civil rights opinion, something that boosted the liberty of individuals. It's no coincidence that it was in that same year that O'Connor v. Donaldson was authored that Hollywood released the movie One Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest. That movie consists of an extremely negative portrayal of mental health institutions as being grave injustices in infringing on the individual rights of the mentally ill people that lived in such institutions. Of course, rather than liberating the mentally ill, rather than helping them or boosting their individual rights, the O'Connor v. Donaldson ruling has been an absolute disaster for people who struggle with mental illness or substance abuse problems. Whereas previously our society would take care of these people, they now have to fend for themselves in a market capitalist society. The struggle that Joker engages in this movie is probably similar to the struggle that many mentally ill people who had to adapt to life outside the mental institution experienced after the O'Connor v. Donaldson Supreme Court decision came out. I can't think of any other movie that's been as bold as Joker to imply that the emptying of mental health institutions was actually maybe not such a great thing, that it may have been bad both for the mentally ill themselves as well as society as a whole. You'll hear a lot of criticism from people on the left who will say things like, our society is wrong for criminalizing mental health or criminalizing substance abuse. They will then put the blame on the right wing for this. The right wing just wants to punish everybody. The right wing is too punitive. However, it is not the right wing that caused the criminalization of mental health and substance abuse. It was the liberals on the Supreme Court in the 1960s and 1970s who created this problem. By reaching decisions like O'Connor v. Donaldson, they created a situation where the government has no ability to help mentally ill people, to help drug addicts, until they've committed a crime. So it is in fact liberal individualism that created this problem of mental health being criminalized and drug addiction being criminalized. This is not a left-wing issue, it's not a right-wing issue. And Joker gets this, and that's why this movie is so brilliant. As the movie progresses, Joker also points out how inadequate the new state response to the mental health issues that the Joker character suffers from is so inadequate. In the beginning of the movie, he's assigned to a social worker whose office is absolutely overstuffed. It appears in the movie that Joker only gets a limited amount of time to interact with this social worker. In fact, she asks him to read his journal and she just quickly thumbs through it. When she notices a sentence that would indicate possible suicidal intent, she asks a few follow-up questions, and that's about it. She doesn't do anything else to help Arthur Fleck, the character name of the Joker. As the movie progresses, it gets even more inadequate as the city ends up canceling its social programs altogether, leaving Arthur Fleck with no way to get medication that could help mitigate some of his mental health issues. The failure of Arthur Fleck's social worker to help him, or the government to help him, ties in with the next theme that features prominently in Joker. And that's the amount of selfishness and lack of compassion for other people demonstrated by nearly every other character in this movie. Arthur Fleck is obviously someone who needs a lot of help, and that's demonstrated by a lot of different characters in this movie, but all of them always fail to help him. It's obvious to the audience that Arthur Fleck has serious problems, but the social worker assigned to help him does nothing to help him. Arthur Fleck confides in a female neighbor of his, and she fails to do anything to help Arthur Fleck. In fact, during the movie, he imagines that she is there trying to help him, but in fact, she isn't. He later breaks into her apartment, and once again, she sees that he is very disturbed, that he is suicidal, but she does nothing to help him. At one point in the movie, Arthur Fleck believes that Thomas Wayne is his father, and he goes to Wayne Mansion in order to try and get an audience with Thomas. This is a big deal to Arthur Fleck's character. It is clear in several scenes in the movie that he very much desires a male character that perhaps could fit the role of sort of like a father to him. And once again, upon traveling to Wayne Mansion, nobody helps him. When he ends up almost choking the guard by the gate, once again, no help is extended to him. And later on, when he sneaks into a theater to confront Thomas Wayne, which by the way is a brilliant idea to include in the movie because everyone knows the origin story of Batman, and it definitely leads you to believe that this is going to be a confrontation where Joker ends up killing Bruce Wayne's parents. But that doesn't happen, and that's why I think that's a great scene. But that aside, once again, Arthur Fleck, during his confrontation with Thomas Wayne, behaves in a way that makes it incredibly obvious that he is mentally disturbed. Thomas Wayne is probably the most powerful person in Gotham City. He is definitely someone with the resources who could help Arthur Fleck, but he declines to do so. He first of all insults Arthur Fleck for assuming that the reason that he's inquiring into his lineage isn't because it's deeply personally important to him, but rather assumes that it's a scheme to make money. He ultimately ends up punching Arthur Fleck in the face and tells him to stay away from his family or he'll fucking kill him. This plays into what I think is the third theme of the movie, which is that everyone is too selfish and too individualist. Joker brilliantly captures how self-absorbed everyone is in modern-day US society. Now, the most controversial theme in this movie is violence. This is very much a vigilante movie. Joker is a vigilante type character. If you asked me to provide similar types of movies to the Joker, I would probably direct your attention towards Taxi Driver or the Death Wish series, which I mentioned earlier. The movie series where at least one of the sequels was semi-inspired by Bernard Goetz. In the movie, Arthur Fleck is subjected to a series of injustices. And over time, he comes to the conclusion that the only way to deal with the injustices is to resort to violence. So when he's hassled on the subway by 3 white investment bankers, he ends up shooting and killing them. When he learns that his mom has been lying to him and that she abused him as a child, he ends up killing her. When he is invited onto a late night comedy show for the purposes of being made fun of, he ends up shooting the TV host. Of course, all of this ends with the Joker committed to some sort of insane asylum. This is exactly the place he should have been to begin with, the place that he indicated that he was more comfortable living at in the beginning of the movie. Of course, due to the changes that happened in US law in the 70s and 80s, that was no longer a possibility. The only way for someone like him to end up in an insane asylum at that point would be to pose a risk of danger to other people. And that's only likely to be evidenced by the fact that he committed crimes. It is also, in my view, the only appropriate way to end a movie such as this. While earlier I described the Joker as a vigilante type character and that he commits violence for reasons of remedying injustices he experiences, for an ordinary person who would experience similar types of injustices, it clearly would not be warranted to take it to the level that the Joker does. And therefore, I think that the only appropriate ending to this movie would have to be that Arthur Fleck ends up in either prison or he ends up in an insane asylum. And that's exactly how the movie ends. Of course, prior to that point in the movie, Joker's conduct, culminating in the shooting of a TV host on live television, has culminated in a mass riot of people imitating the Joker's behavior. These rioters appear to have reflected on the actions taken by the Joker and come to the same conclusion that they have experienced a wide variety of injustices, and those injustices could only be remedied by violence. And this is the fate of Bruce Wayne's parents. One of the rioters identifies Thomas Wayne and his wife, and he recognizes the injustice in the class divide. Like I talked about earlier in this video, there are people who work for a living, and then there are people who don't have to work for a living. And Thomas Wayne would fall into that later category. And it's because he is recognized as Thomas Wayne, and because the rioter is disgusted with him, that he ends up killing him and his wife. Now, I don't think that Todd Phillips is so cynical that what he's trying to say with this movie is that injustices need to be dealt with violently. In fact, I think what he's trying to say that if a human being or a large group of human beings are subjected to enough injustices over a period of time, eventually that individual or group of individuals may end up lashing out violently, and that could cause some sort of chain reaction. The best thing to do would not be to embrace the violence, but rather to reform society so there's not so much injustice. Maybe if people were less self-absorbed, less individualistic, if there were more abilities for us to help people suffering from mental illness, suffering from substance abuse, then maybe we would live in a better, less violent place. Now, there's a lesser theme of this movie, and that theme focuses mostly on humor. I don't know if you've experienced this phenomenon, but I have before. Sometimes when people see something absolutely horrifying, they laugh. For example, if you were standing on a street corner and you witnessed a bulldozer accidentally run over another human being, there's a possibility that you might just burst out in laughter. But that's clearly not funny, and you're not experiencing humor. You didn't think that was funny. It just sort of triggered that reaction. In fact, there are a lot of situations where we experience some sort of mental emotion like shock, and it produces a counterintuitive sort of physical response. I'll give you one strange personal example of this. Now, I've read in a book before, and I'm not certain exactly which book it was, but it said that upon seeing justice being done in a very strong and significant way, it can end up causing someone to have a physical reaction to it. I myself experienced this watching another movie, and that movie was 12 Years a Slave. I'm now going to give you a second spoilers warning. I'm now going to spoil the ending of 12 Years a Slave. So if you really want to watch that movie and haven't watched it yet for some reason, then you might want to skip ahead, skip this part of the video. But in 12 Years a Slave, the movie deals with this guy who was a free black man living in the North, who's kidnapped, brought to work as a slave on a southern plantation. And in the whole movie, it's about him struggling to send a single letter. And the movie documents all of the horrible things that he sees and has to go through. And finally, what you would think would be something as simple as writing a letter takes him the entire movie to be able to do it. But he ends up able to send the letter, and then someone who knows him, a white man from back where he lived, shows up with the police, and he is freed. And this is not a sad part of the movie by any means. It's the best part of the movie, the part where the guy gets freed. Like, nothing bad has happened or anything like that. But during that scene, I got all teary-eyed. It was the emotion of having seen an injustice remedied. But going back to this idea of humor and violence, likewise, watching something violent, seeing something extremely violent or horrible can also cause someone to laugh. And this is something that Arthur Fleck's character in the movie experiences several times. Because of his mental illness, he begins to believe that he finds violence to be funny. And this sort of distortion that he reaches makes his mental illness even worse. I think this theme really coincides with another unique aspect of how comedy works. A lot of the things that we find funny and we laugh at is because we have a certain expectation of what's going to happen, and then something different or perhaps even the opposite happens. This phenomenon, the one that leads us to find things that are unexpected to be funny, is the reason why certain really bad movies are funny to watch. For example, The Room with Tommy Wiseau. Having become accustomed to watching movies that are competently made, watching one that is off the wall, incompetent, is the opposite of what people expect, and it produces laughter and humor. The Joker movie itself addresses this phenomenon. So Arthur Fleck does a stand-up performance where he is trying to be funny, but his jokes are very bad. In fact, he is so bad that he's the exact opposite of what someone would expect out of a stand-up comedian. This leads to a later scene in the movie where clips from his stand-up are performed on a late-night talk show for comedy purposes. They're so bad, they're funny. And it leads the talk show host to invite Arthur Fleck on as a guest on his show. When Arthur Fleck appears on the show, he does this crazy Conan O'Brien style walk over to the guest chair. And it looks very much like the expectation of the audience is going to be met. That Arthur Fleck is going to be this ridiculous character who is so bad at comedy that it's actually funny how bad he is. The scene that follows is anything but. It is one of the most serious, unfunny, uncomfortable to watch, awkward scenes that I've ever seen in any movie. If Todd Phillip's goal was to make the audience of the Joker movie empathize with the audience of the fake TV show, then he succeeded 100%. He knocked it out of the fucking ballpark. That's an incredibly uncomfortable, incredibly brilliant scene. So I've been going on for a while now, so why don't I try and close this thing out and give some parting thoughts on this movie. I think that if you haven't seen it, you should definitely watch it. I'd highly recommend it. I think it's a brilliant movie. I think it has great social commentary. I think it makes some pretty bold political statements. I don't think this movie was meant to push some sort of post-liberal message, but I think it does so absolutely. There's definitely allusions between this film and a film like V for Vendetta, Whereas in V for Vendetta, there was a fascist government and ultimately a rebellion by these anarchist type people wearing the Guy Fawkes mask. I feel that Joker, in comparison, rather than the fascist government, in its place is the extreme liberal individualist type society that we live in today. And instead of the anarchists wearing Guy Fawkes masks, we have these rioters wearing clown masks rioting against the liberal individualist society that we live in. Although the movie is set in the 1980s during some made-up garbage strike in the city of Gotham, I think that setting is very relevant today. There's news stories running every week talking about the trash and filth problem in certain cities like Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. You have the Los Angeles city prosecutor who contracted typhus after she was bitten by a flea that came off of a diseased rat. In the Joker movie, the garbage-filled streets and rat infestation problem is caused by a garbage strike, whereas in modern times, the reason that we have so much trash and garbage in the modern leftist cities is the fact that they tolerate so much homelessness and drug addiction. However, these are the same sorts of problems that are caused by the self-absorption, the failure to help people that this movie criticizes. And therefore, even though it's set in the 80s, it's very relevant for today's politics. I hope you liked this video about the politics of the Joker movie. I know it sort of turned into a review of the movie as well. If you're not already subscribed to my channel, please consider subscribing. If you want to discuss any thoughts that you have about the movie, feel free to leave a comment. And thanks for making it to the end.